Yeah, the attitude.
I'm next. I'm next. I was earlier, right?
Did Al call you?
Let me call on him, then her, then her.
She was before me.
Oh, she was before you? All
He
right.
has a gun.
What I wanted to say is that you didn't mention drones, and from what I understand and what they're saying now is that bring troops home, drone them, kill them that way. That's one thing, and they're doing it in all of our wars, our whatever 11, whatever they are, all over the world, especially like they're doing it in Yemen and all over. But people don't know this, and every time I bring it up, people say, "Oh no, that's not pacifism." The Yemeni army that is fighting back right now, and I know all about it, and hardly anybody does because my son-in-law. I can't get him to come here because there's some reasons, but they have a huge drone program now going on in Yemen against the Saudis. And they have ballistic missiles where they're firing into Saudi Arabia every single day. The only reason the Saudis are still, quote unquote, winning is because they are so high in the air, they can't shoot them. If they go over regular, they shoot them down all the time now. People don't know this. They don't know how strong. They've moved up into Saudi Arabia. They are pretty much present at all 3 air bases right above Yemen. They're Saudi Air Force bases. They've taken them over. They're
Who's the they?
the Yemeni army.
Okay.
People all think they're monkeys with sandals. No, I'm sorry. They're educated and they're doing really well, but they can't with the U.S. continuing to refuel.
Okay, let me clarify this. You're talking about those Yemenis which are not on the side of the Saudis, right? The opposite.
They're actually the Yemenis on the side of the Saudis are basically Al Qaeda and ISIS.
I thought that the ex-president was on their side.
The ex-president isn't anything. Hadi is up in Saudi Arabia. He's up in the capital. He's he doesn't. He's been sick most of the time. He came to the U.S. for a while to get help. He's nothing. People are not on his side. There is a huge. In fact, even Amy Goodman had to show the millions in the street that are on the side of the army, the Yemeni army. It's more connected than it's ever been before. People don't know this because of our press. Our press is saying, "Oh, poor monkeys, take off their sandals and run back to the trees." No, it's not like that at all. I wanted to say that, and then I wanted to say one thing about that period in the 50s, I didn't know you were going to get to that, but yeah, the McCarthyism, yes, it was army and everything too. It was also anybody. My dad was a union organizer, and he was scared to death in the 50s because they kept coming to our house in the middle of the night, the FBI and stuff like that. So if they were coming to our house for a union, or you just think what they were doing to the people who were trying to, be against the service. So anyway, that's all I had to say.
Okay, let me mention 2 quick comments in relationship to that. One is when I said the Cold War, I meant the impact of the Cold War in general, including that. Okay, I didn't mean it specific to certain segments that were organizing in certain areas, but the impact to everyone. I mean, it even affected me, affected my father, who was not politically involved at all. Okay, but he knew what McCarthy was, and that did have an impact on him because he always warned me never to get involved in any political organizations because I might get into trouble and not get a job. Okay? But the question of drones and all that sort of stuff, yet today in asymmetrical warfare, which is old, but in the present day it has certain characteristics. Asymmetrical means the weaker finds a way to deal with the stronger. Drones is one way that the weaker finds the ability to deal with the stronger. Even today, I heard that groups like ISIS has drones. Anybody can have drones. The left, in fact, one of my early suggestions was that the left should use drones to keep track of the police during demonstrations. Drones are cheap to buy. not expensive. You get a small, cheap drone. You can, you go over the city and you can see the whole police movements and so forth. And you can relay that to the demonstrators. So you won't get boxed in or whatever the case might be. But those kinds of weapons can be used by both sides. Okay, that's the point.
Bomb drones, though, you have to have certain planes and all kinds of stuff. You have to have that all set up. They have the bomb drones. I'm talking about where they're killing people.
Yeah, okay, all right. But I'm saying that drones per se can be used for different purposes, including can be used by the demonstrators. IEDs, right, were examples of asymmetrical warfare. Car bombs, shoe bombs. You name it. All asymmetrical warfare. Weaker forces using small weapons, which they can make, homemade weapons, which they can use against far more heavily armed forces. Okay, I agree with you about the drone thing and other possibilities. But that has to do a lot with high-tech warfare, which has to do also with the use of computers.
So,
why don't you go?
He sees you. So that makes the peaceniks our enemy. Because they're conditioning people. That's the big difference in attitude, is that the people who are urging for peace are urging against us uniting to fight back. And alongside of that argument, let's see, my brother was in the Concerned Officers Movement. He at first he enlisted because he thought he should go in as regular. He had graduated college by that time, and he enlisted. And then when he got in and saw that he was likely to be serving the wrong way, he took his commission as whatever captain or lieutenant or whatever position, so that he could survive the war. And then eventually, when he said that he was going, I said, goodbye, I'm never going to see you again. And I don't know if that affected him in any kind of way, but because we weren't that close. But he joined the Conservative Officers Movement, that Lou fellow, L-O-U. Anyway, started it, and he went for his CO, which was, a mild suggestion to stand there. And my folks were in the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I grew up absent organizing. I lived in Chicago. I didn't know that there was resistance and so forth in the 40s and 50s. I got married in the 50s or something like that. Yeah. So it's a kind of a different attitude. Getting ready to do anything. There was nobody to do it with, as far as I could tell.
Okay. That was the comment, not a question. Okay, go ahead.
So first thing, I was trying to figure out how to word this, but based on previous talks you've given or parts of talks, the one thing I thought was missing today, and I'm only encouraging you to add something to the next time you do it, is the role of women in the war, anti-war. Because usually you're the best one on it about anything, no matter what you're talking about. But for me, during the 60s and early 70s up to 75, the role of women in different ways was really important, and probably had a lot more potential even than we used early on. But I met my first wife in late 67, early 68, out of a German Stuttgart coffee house where the kids hung out and talked about this shit. I don't know how many GIs went there, but I was a GI then, and And that's why we went there, and there was a big demonstration that day. And when I started marching with her and her brother, he ended up being my best friend, and she ended up being my wife and the mother of my kids. So I'm just saying that I don't know how many guys anything like that happened to, or whatever, or wherever in here. But also in the second period, after I got home in the early 70s, Jane Fonda, Barbara Dane, a bunch of people went to those however many coffee houses you said, and started working with the GIs. And a lot of those were women-led, women-dominated, and besides losing your life is the biggest thing I guess you can lose. The second thing would be for men, young men, would be losing your girlfriend or whatever you want to call it. I'm being gentle right now, but just saying that one of the demands was they want to go fight, just cut them off. I mean, sorry, strike.
Yeah.
And that, regardless of how actual successful that tactic or that line was, it was scary as hell if anybody even thought about it, let alone how effective it might actually be. I'm just saying. And I wanted to say just from the 50s thing when sorry about that, one difference between the Korean War in 50-53 and the Vietnam War, and which really was started in 56 or something like that, as far as I'm concerned, when the French caved and Eisenhower came in and wouldn't let them have the elections and stuff like they promised after 2 years, so because they knew Ho Chi Minh would win and they'd be unified, so they said, ain't happening, this is not a democratic country, we're not going to let you have elections. But the point is that I personally think that the period of the 50s and the Korean War, first of all, it was only, say, roughly 5 years after the World War II. I mean, for one thing, I think there's a kind of a worn out, we're tired of war, everybody. My husband just came home, you guys, what? So it wasn't talked about, it wasn't played up in the media. The second thing is that Kennedy was the first president to use the media, really TV kind of stuff, I think, in the big debate against Nixon and all shit. Well, there wasn't really TV to the degree in the 50s like there was in the 60s. So a lot of the learning that we did was we saw things on TV that you can't see now because they've learned. They're not going to let that crap on TV because they're going to get pissed off when they see all these villages being burned out and shit. And I'm just going to, uranium in the sand and so in the Middle East, that's not right. But we don't want to hear about it. So you see what I'm saying? So my point is, it's a great question. I think the difference between Korea and Vietnam and why. But I think we learned during the Korean War, and part of what we learned is what we didn't know when it was happening. We being more activists, and the only one I ever knew was Andy Truskier, that worked here in Berkeley during the Vietnam War. And his big thing was every time he could go to North Korea, he was out there talking about Kim Il-sung the whole time and Juche and all this stuff, trying to get us to pay attention to all the history we'd missed. Because it was really important and we didn't know nothing. We still don't know very much.
Okay. There are two points that you made. One was about women in the anti-war movement, and the second was about television. In my original talk, I did talk more about women. I cut out at least a third of what the original talk was, okay? But, I did mention in passing the Gold Star Mothers Against the War, okay? And I also, among the 30-odd lectures that I've given 2 on women and war in 8-9 years ago, something like that. Now, I might give them again, because the only person that I remember that was there during the time was Norma. Then the second part about television and the Korean War, the whole media issue, which I didn't really bring up, except maybe indirectly, I think is very relevant. And today's use of social media can play a bigger role in this whole movement. I mean, it does play some role in the anti-war movement and other movements, but it can play a lot bigger role in terms of a relationship to those that are already in the military. Okay, him and then him.
You mentioned that during the Iraq War, the army made it more difficult to organize, and I was just wondering, how did they do that? And I was also wondering, were you get your information about this, where can we do our own study about resistance during the Iraq invasion? And then also, just wanted to know what the status of the coffee houses are today. Are they still active? It seems to me that that's a useful tool, and we should be reactivating those if they're not active right now.
Okay. So you asked about what were the lessons
No, in what way
that the U.S. learned, the government
did
learned?
the military make it more difficult to organize
Yeah.
during the
Okay, so how did the U.S. military make it more difficult to organize in subsequent wars? And the second question,
just where is the source material for this? For information such as that
about what?
about the Army's tactics during the Iraq War to quell any dissidents within its ranks.
Okay. And third?
Just the status of coffee houses.
Oh, the coffee house. So let me begin with that. I think there's one coffee house that's still around in Kaleen, Texas, Fort Hood. I think it is Fort Hood in Texas. I think it's the one at Fort Hood still in existence. The lessons that were learned, and the military, they actually wrote it's actually a book written by a sociologist whose doctoral dissertation was on that subject. And aside from directly threatening soldiers from communicating with civilians, they tried to control their communications devices, particularly during the Iraq War. Tried to control their things like emails that were censored as much as they could. And it was, aside from threats, it was mainly information control that they concentrated on. Again, I have to recall that book. I don't recall the details of that book, unfortunately, which I have sitting at home gathering dust. But I will check it, and I'll send you the name of the book. Okay, when I find it. Let me make a note on that. I can tell you, and this is a historical thing rather than something that deals with the United States. One of the things that the German government did to just prior, say between 1900 and 1914, was to prevent anybody from the Social Democratic Party from joining the military. If they joined, because that was a project, was to join the military and organize. So what they did was that the Social Democratic Party would, if one was affiliated with it, they wouldn't say that. Yeah? But the government had ways of finding out. But then if they found out, it wasn't that you were just dismissed from the army, you were sent to jail for a period of years. Okay? When they got out, assuming that they were able to successfully hide their identity, they also forbid any member of any socialist party member from being in the reserves. And after they got out of the army in Germany, they would be in the reserves for a certain amount of time, right? They found out they were in the reserves, they would also send them to jail. So that they had to hide their political identity. And they were watched. If they had a hunch that this guy was in the party, they were followed. Stuff like that. They made it directly difficult for them to organize. But
unlike now,
I can't. I can't give. I'll send you the book. Because my mind is kind of just conglomerated now. But him and then her.
do people who haven't spoken get a chance before people go, yeah?
Oh, you haven't spoken? Was your hand up?
My hand was up.
Oh, I didn't see it. Okay.
It's been up.
I thought
No,
I
I
was
just
stretching.
wanted to ask you, you talked about the Second Amendment and, you know, well-regulated militia
Right.
and so on. And recent scholarship suggests that a well-regulated militia meant killing Indians and capturing escaped slaves. So I wonder if you want to comment on these recent people who say, you know, no, it's a reactionary use of military that was intended by the Second Amendment.
As opposed to protecting against the colonialists who would like to overtake the U.S. government.
Okay. The question is the use of the militia for nefarious means.
Well, specifically against Indians and blacks.
Yeah, specifically against Indians and blacks. The answer is yes, of course, because as I said, not this time, but in the previous time, I said that up until 1904, up until the War of 1898, the militia was a major force in the army. It was not the federal army that went and fought. Even in the so-called, quote, Indian wars, a lot of militias were used. And you talk about the Civil War, the federal army was not the majority. The majority were groups that were called the 2nd Illinois Infantry, the 3rd Missouri Artillery. Those were all militia groups. They were not part of the federal army. And so, the local militias were used in catching runaway slaves or used against Native Americans. That was not their only use, but that were two of their uses. The fact that the government, Reconstruction government, organized a black militia is not exactly, I would say, not exactly spoken about by the left, probably because it's not that well known. But they were used against those who tried to reimpose slavery or those that were opposed to the Reconstructionist project. And there were battles, of these militias against whites, including the Klan, which is one reason why the Klan strengthened all of a sudden to fight these black militias. Right? These militias ended with Reconstruction. When Reconstruction ended, they went. But I'll say that's what you say is true, but it's also true of these other groups that are not mentioned so frequently. I mean, the militias were arms of the state. And what was the state doing in those particular times? It's just like any army. It was their army, not our army.
Al, I have a question about the tactics of those who want to keep the U.S. Army from waging wars today as against Vietnam War time. Now today, I understand the soldiers are pretty well paid and they come from poorer families, so it's a poverty draft. And does anything you have said in organizing and so forth, does it change with this situation? Can you comment on that?
What has changed?
Means you were describing organizing the military
Yeah.
and soldiers.
Yeah.
And the soldiers were drafted in Germany and Russia and the United States in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Since that time, the U.S. Army is basically paid people who
Okay.
go there because they're too poor.
All right, I got it.
Yeah.
All right. There's still, most of the soldiers that go into the military now are from the working class. They're not, like middle class or anything. But the question was difference today between soldiers and during earlier wars. I'd say that there's two differences. Okay, one is the lack of a draft. The civilian movement against the war in Vietnam was initially was largely initiated because people, particularly college students, wanted to get out of the draft, right? And so, that situation doesn't exist anymore. Okay? And not just college students, of course, but also other GIs that were drafted, okay, who revolted against the war. But that doesn't exist anymore. And also, as a consequence of that not existing, the military has, as feared by the original founders, gotten more and more removed from the average citizen, which is why I say that the concentration should be on organizing among the National Guard and reservists who are closer mentally as well as physically to civilians. Right now, it's estimated that 2/3 of those in the military have parents or brothers or sisters that were already in the military. So that there's like a slowly becoming a perpetual cycle of the same people, same in terms of their relatives that are in the military. And that removes them from the rest of us. Okay? I'd say that's a factor that plays a role in why that there's this lack of organizing, along with the lack of the draft. You know. Yes.
A couple of things. I'm sorry, I got a block.
You can have it back. Can I talk? He forgot it for a moment.
Yeah,
We
go
have about
ahead.
2 minutes left.
Okay, well,
You got it?
yeah.
All right, go ahead.
There are a lot of, I remember, there's a lot of non-violent people out there and pacifists as well. And I've always said, use the example of Cuba, you know, when they're dealing with them. Number one, what would you say to the pacifists and non-violent people? And then secondly, maybe I missed it, but is there anything good about militias?
It depends on who's in the militia. That's what would be the deciding factor on if there's anything good about the militias. Depends on who is in the militias, and also secondly what they do. Right now, the militias that are on the left, okay, are a smaller minority than the militias on the right. The militias on the right are more, they might be a minority of those on the right, but as a percentage of those on the right, they're greater in number. Not overwhelming, you know, but greater. I'd say an advantage of the militia would be self-defense, not against the state, okay, but against the right-wing militias. That in the future, if the movement becomes so strong that the right wanted to attack them physically, and particularly with weapons, that knowledgeable persons who understood tactics and who understood how to use weapons tactically could act as protectors of non-armed protesters or activists. This is nothing new. As I mentioned before that we had militias on the left. I say that there are a lot fewer, but it's nothing new in that that in other movements that were considered non-violent, okay, movements, there is an error in most of them. It's a question of whether they're non-violent for the most part or non-violent completely. And in most cases, the so-called, quote, non-violent movements always had an armed component to them. And I will mention the civil rights movement as an example. People would go out in the daytime, and they would march, right, non-violently, and they'd have stuff thrown at them and so forth, but they were disciplined. They would go home at night, okay? If they were attacked by the Klansmen in their homes, they would pull out their weapons and shoot, okay? So yeah, there was non-violent, but then there was violence. Also, too, in Mississippi, there's a really excellent book that came out that showed that on many occasions, the black persons with rifles would be standing aside from those that were marching non-violently as a deterrent from them being attacked, particularly by the police. Okay, that's hardly mentioned, all right, in civil rights history, all right. But more and more is coming out about this. More and more studies have shown that it was actually, it may have been mostly nonviolent, but it also had an armed resistance component. Even, I'd say, in India that was the case. People talk about Gandhi and all that, but there was a violent resistance component occurring in India at the same time that Gandhi was going on, and they both contributed to it.
They both lost.
That's one thing. That's what I consider to be good, is armed self-defense. And the second point that you made?
No, you meant, how do you deal with pacifism?
How do I deal with pacifists?
You already dealt with it.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Something really quick about, do people know about Sudan? Anybody look at that?
What about Sudan? Yeah, I know it exists. What about it?
Huge, big demonstrations in the street. There's all kinds of shit's happening. They want to get rid of their ruler, okay?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia has, and most of them, I don't know if it's half of them or most of them, a whole lot are women. They're involved. They're involved in a huge way. Women there.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to say is that Saudi Arabia has been going to Sudan, taking kids and bringing them over to Yemen and getting them killed. I mean, they're going into Yemen to fight on the side. You know, they just grab them and you have to go fight their forces, whatever.
You say they're fighting on the Saudi side?
Well, it's not like they need to. They just picked up. They're poor and they need to have a job and they're mercenaries.
Yeah, I know. Okay, they use them as child soldiers, but they go there. But there's
the Yemeni army just wipes them out, and so that's part of their big fight right now. Stop taking and murdering our kids. That's a one big fight. You never hear of. I only know about it because of my son-in-law. He's on top of Middle Eastern news, which is almost all in Arabic.
And his native, what is it? He's native.
He's Yemeni. Yemeni, yeah. So, anyway.
Yes, sir.
Is it Ecuador that has no military at all?
What?
Is it Ecuador that has no military at all?
Ecuador?
Or Costa Rica? There's a
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica.
Yeah.
So that's probably the ideal, no military. But
Yeah, but you realize that they have a how shall I say, a quote armed security force, even if it's not a military.
interesting. No, I didn't know that. I'll look into that.
Yeah, look into it. They do.
We have to win first.
What I'm wondering is there a country that certainly would have a national military that uses it well, so it's responsible in its use, that has the loyalty of the citizenry, that sort of, ironically, it's probably none of the countries on the permanent, on the UN Security Council permanent members, but is there a country?
Well, there are countries in which don't fight wars, you know, but they tend to be small peripheral kinds of countries. What I would think, if you're thinking about a major country that does that, I'd say the only one I can think of is Switzerland, which has a national militia army that doesn't fight outside its borders. It hasn't fought a war since, I don't know, 1700s, whenever they stopped fighting for the Pope.
When I say uses it well, I mean really uses it not at all. It's to say it's there as a deterrent, but wants to preserve the peace. So Switzerland, it sounds like.
Yes, it's only a major country that I would say that does. And there are other countries that have armies that never fight. but they're never, I say they're around other, quote, peaceable countries,
Right.
so.
It'll be a great day
Iceland,
when
Iceland, right?
when we are able to talk to those militia that we consider to be the enemy in this country, the white nationalist kinds of people, when we can talk to them and say, you want everybody to have housing, you want everybody to have security and where they live and can get survival.